Hey guys, Mr. Danner here. Getting ready to start a new unit, and I guess we did the other day, but this is the first real assignment for this unit. So just to let you know, we're closing out right before winter break, and so I'm only going to give a couple of assignments, but we're starting into this unit. It's going to be very brief. So it's Unit 4. It's going to be labeled, this lesson is going to be labeled 4.1, How and Why did the United States build a transcontinental railroad in Google Classroom. So as you watch this video, you may want to have that open. But here we are, Unit 4, and I introduced the compelling question of, does development mean progress? And if you if you weren't in class or haven't really looked at the Jamboard or Padlet, depending on what class period you're in, go back to the stuff that I posted in Google Classroom and read some of the discussion in the Jamboard and the Padlet that talks about those two words, development and progress. Because if you don't know what those words mean, and especially if you don't really know the difference between those two words, you're going to have a really hard time answering that question at the end of the unit. So make sure you spend some time just reflecting on those if you weren't in class on the first day of the unit. So again, the question that we're going to look at is, does development mean progress? And so what we're going to look at is some ways where in the 19th century, which is the 1800s, our country developed and grew and expanded. But we're going to ask, is that really making progress? Are they progressing? Are they getting better? Is the country changing for the better? So what we're going to look at is two things that may seem at the offset disconnected, but they are very, very, very much connected. We're going to look at the building of a transcontinental railroad, and you'll understand what that means after today. And then we're going to look at, so the first question is going to be, how and why did the United States build a transcontinental railroad? And then we're going to go further with the next lesson, which will be next week, about how did the U.S. government begin to exploit indigenous peoples in the 19th century. And so we'll get into that next week, but it's going to be directly connected to this transcontinental railroad that we're going to look at today. So a couple of things I want to point out. This is going to be a thing where you answer the questions on the PowerPoint and turn it in. What I've done is anytime that you have to answer a question, because people always see questions here and be like, do I have to answer those? No. So what I did is anytime you have to answer a question, I made the background white. So like here, there's a question you need to answer. Number one, I also number the questions. It's 1 through 6. Here, there's a question you have to answer. Here, there's not. The background is purple or blue, however you see that. I see purple. Here, you don't need to answer a question. Here, there are questions on the page. You do not need to answer them. So anytime you see a white background, you're going to have a question to answer. And so I'm going to go through these. There's a total of 6 questions that you're going to have to answer based on some pictures, a couple quotes, and a couple of videos. So what I wanted to start out is just by talking about this idea of a transcontinental railroad and a railroad. So I'm going to go through this first quote with you and give you a little bit of guidance. But this is, if you don't know, there was a time in our country where railroads were king, and railroads really were the best and most efficient way to transport goods and certain things across our country. And we're not going to get into that now, but it played a big role in like the Civil War and some benefits for the North and things like that. But so just know that as railroads were getting built, there was a lot of money to be made if you knew how to take advantage. And so this first quote says, when Commodore Vanderbilt began the world, he had nothing. And there were no steamboats or railroads. So they're talking about time before railroads existed in our country. He was 35 years old when the first locomotive was put into use in America. When he died, railroads had become the greatest force in modern industry. And notice, I'll tell you right now, this date is 1881. So they're talking about things that happened before 1881. But they become the greatest force in modern industry. And Vanderbilt was the richest man in Europe or America, and the largest owner of railroads in the world. So you can tell by this quote, this is a railroad owner, somebody who owned railroad companies and helped in building them. The history is not yet finished, but the railroads owe on stocks and bonds of $4.6 billion more than twice our national debt, meaning that people have bought stocks and bonds and railroads worth $4.6 billion, which is more than our country is really owes to other countries. 1.5 times more than the government's revenue last year. So again, the stocks and bonds that railroads sold, 274 million versus, or I'm sorry, yeah, the stocks and bonds that railroads sold, 4.6 billion versus the 274 million that our government, our national government brought in. So railroads were making a lot more money even than our government was making in taxes. More than any other class, our railroad men have developed the country as well as challenged our country's institutions. So you're going to go into the next slide, and the same quote is there, exact same quote, talking about how much money there is in railroads and how it became just like the backbone of our country. So you're going to see this question or a very similar question pop up a few times in this lesson. But what story or view of railroads do you get when you read this quote? And so I'm going to help you out. It's going to talk about basically, this last line kind of sums it up. More than any other class, our railroad men have developed the country as well as challenged our country's institutions. So they're saying that the railroads have really helped our country to develop, again, grow and expand. And so railroads were the greatest force in modern industry. And Vanderbilt was the richest man in Europe or America. So for me, and you can put something different, but for me, this quote is really telling you that railroads helped the country to grow and expand. And you might even want to take the time to bold underline that, or unbold underline it, but underline that, highlight it. More than has developed the country. Railroads helped our country to grow and expand in the 1800s. There were billions of dollars of revenue, which is money to be made in railroad companies. Railroads were among the richest businesses in our country. And you can get that just from, they own stocks and bonds. That means that people have bought stocks and bonds worth $4.6 billion, right? And so those are some things. That's the story, is that the railroads are just making a lot of money and helping our country to grow and expand. And I would say that this is generally a positive view of railroads. So that's question one. There's a total of 6 questions. This is the last one I'm going to really give you, so you can use any of this. I'm going to delete this because sometimes it shows up in your PowerPoints, but if you need to go back, just pause the video. So now we're going to look at a transcontinental railroad, and you're going to get some explanation, but basically these were essentially existing railroad lines in the early mid 1800s in our country. And the goal was to build a railroad that connected all the way to the west. And so there were 2 lines that were kind of building towards each other. The Union Pacific Line and the Central Pacific Line, they were kind of building towards, and the goal was to meet in the middle there. And so that's what the Transcontinental Railroad, trans meaning across the continent, crossing the continent. So that was the goal, was to build this railroad that would go all the way from New York. You see, this is all connected all the way to California. And so that's what a transcontinental railroad was. Now we're going to get into how that affected the Indians and things like that later, but we're going to focus today on how and why did the U.S. build a transcontinental railroad? And the first thing you can see is, from the how and why, you can get there was a lot of money to be made in it. That's the why. Now, the next question is right here. What is the Transcontinental Railroad and why was it built? Short video. I'm not going to play a YouTube video on a YouTube video, but all you need to do is hit play here, and it will start playing the video. All right, if it doesn't work, you can probably open this video in YouTube itself, but then just, from the video, it's a 3 minute and 40 second video. What was the Transcontinental Railroad and why was it built? I went into it a little bit up here, but get it from the video. Watch the video. And it's going to talk about why it was built, who built it, because that's where we're going to go next, and what was significant about it. So then we're going to get into this idea of Chinese American immigrants, because they were the people who built, among others, they were a main source of a group of people who labored to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. So the rest of this lesson is going to be about their life and their how the Transcontinental Railroad affected them at the time and even after. So this video is going to talk about some people who worked on the railroads from the viewpoint of their ancestors, of the people of their great grandchildren and great grandchildren, and talked about how their life was on the railroads and then what it was like after. And so based on the video, you're going to answer, how did Chinese railroad workers experience this? How did their life on the railroad influence their lives after the work was complete? And it's going to talk about kind of like how it shaped the people they became. So that's next. It's going to talk about the experience of these workers and how it shaped who they were. You may get a little bit more positive viewpoint of the railroad from this, which is fine. Next is an image. This is a railroad camp, and there's a couple things to point out, but make sure that you're looking at this annotation here. The railroad company provided dorms or train cars for white workers. So the white workers would kind of sit in these train cars and be able to sleep in these kind of protected train cars, while the Chinese workers lived in these tents. And going back to this question, what story? Well, right here. Now, what story or view of the Transcontinental Railroad does this image give? Think about the way the workers are treated, the fairness, things like that. What story or view of the Transcontinental Railroad does this image give? Just answer it in here. Next is a quote, and it's talking about, this is Chinese workers in California. And again, going back to, you may want to just do some highlighting, some underlining, basically do your annotating, some, commenting if you want, because that's what real annotating is. But this quote is pretty straightforward, talking about the experience of the workers, how they laid the tracks, how much they laid, how much they were paid. And then I'm going to ask the same question based on this. What story or view of the Transcontinental Railroad does this image give? Is it giving a positive or a negative image? And really, what are you getting from the building of the Transcontinental Railroad from this image? So the goal was to look at just different viewpoints of the Transcontinental Railroad, how it was built, why it was built, who benefited, who kind of suffered while it was being built. And so then, to close out this lesson, you're going to have to go back through these sources, the videos, the readings, the pictures, and you're going to find some evidence. I wrote a claim here. And for this claim, what you're going to do is find two pieces of evidence and then explain why you chose each of those pieces of evidence. So the claim is right here. The United States built the Transcontinental Railroad on the backs of its workers with little regard for their well-being. So the claim I wrote is talking about how the railroad was built and the workers kind of suffered and struggled and were, had a hard life while building it. So you need to find some evidence from these sources and tell me why you use that piece of evidence. So you may just want to use here. You can use a quote. You can, I'm not saying here, but you can potentially copy and paste, a quote right here, paste it in here that talks about maybe the way they lived or the way they worked or what they were paid. Use that as your evidence, but then your reasoning is telling me, how does this evidence support the claim? Tell me. You can use this. This is where like a lot of people like to, to copy paste stuff. And sometimes that's okay. Here it can be okay, but you need to explain why that evidence is important. How does this evidence support the claim? So find a piece of evidence that talks about, the difficulty of working on these railroads, and then explain why you use that piece of evidence. Then find a second piece of evidence, probably from a different source, and do the same thing. And that's really all this assignment is. Once you've done that, just hit turn in, and then we're going to move on to how the railroad affected the people who were already living on all of this land around here, because that's going to be a big deal in our country's history. But we'll get to that later. So that's all I've got for today. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know.